Hello everyone, I'm David Vaucher. Welcome to Return on Racing. Return on Racing is powered by Vaucher Analytics, which helps race teams and drivers drive efficiencies off track so they can fuel success on track. Return on Racing is also brought to you by the Motorsport Sponsorship Accelerator, the most cutting edge resource out there to learn how to find, grow, and maintain long term sponsorship relationships. And you can find out more about this resource by going to the Vaucher Analytics website and clicking on the link in the navigation bar at the top right of the screen. A couple days ago, I was going through my feed and came across a post from Haggerty where the host was talking about some of the tensions facing the automobile industry. One of them I'm sure you're very familiar with, that is the tension between electric cars and internal combustion engine cars. And that got me thinking about some of the tensions that might be present not just in cars, but motorsports specifically. So, with that in mind, let's just get right into the 7 strategic tensions that could define or derail Formula One's future. Let's get started. Formula One is on a tear. Considerable revenues, expanding global viewership, and cultural relevance like never before. But behind the glamour and growth lies a series of unresolved tensions threatening the sport's long term trajectory, bubbling under the surface and threatening to derail motorsport's Premier Series growth. If you're an F1 team principal, series executive, sponsor, or general stakeholder, these aren't theoretical risks, they're burning platforms. Get them wrong, and the whole ecosystem has the potential to stall. In this episode of Return on Racing, I'll break down the 7 most urgent strategic contradictions shaping the future of Formula One, and more pertinently, what's potentially at stake if they're not addressed head on. So, whether you're analyzing F1 commercially, strategically, or you're just a passionate fan who wants to understand what could be next beyond the on track action, here is your blueprint for what matters. Starting with the number one on this list, which is heritage versus modernization. Can F1 stay premium as it popularizes? Formula One's heritage is a key part of its identity, and actually, for me, part of the appeal of following the sport is diving into some of the archives, whether that be on YouTube or elsewhere, and finding out more about how the sport came to be today from where it came from. Tracks like Monaco and Spa, legendary teams like Ferrari and McLaren, and the aura of exclusivity around the sport generally are the very things that built F1's mystique. However, this mystique can be a double edged sword if F1 wants even more mindshare. Indeed, clinging too tightly to this old guard image makes the sport less accessible to younger, digitally native fans who consume culture in reels, not race programs. The new era of F1, marked by Las Vegas night races, Drive to Survive, influencer paddock access, and TikTok clips, isn't just about modernity. It's about survival because today, if you're not moving forward, you're dying. And if you have doubts about that, just go ask the folks over at IndyCar. Now, this sounds great until you consider the risk. If F1 chases mass appeal too hard, it risks cheapening what made it aspirational in the first place. So the solution depends on F1 being culturally bilingual, fluent in both luxury tradition and viral relevance. That's a fine line to tread, but it's the only way to grow the next generation of fans without abandoning the values that made the sport iconic. Second on the list is franchise stability versus competitive parity. Will the sport still feel like a competition? Liberty Media wants F1 teams to become franchise like assets, valuable, stable, and investment friendly. But here's the paradox: the more you stabilize for investors, the more you risk basically making the sport boring and alienating fans. And this creates a downward spiral where fans stop caring and actually investor valuations end up feeling downwards pressure. So F1 must figure out ways to manufacture controlled volatility, a sense of competition that feels real but doesn't destroy franchise value. And look, I know how that sounds. This is not pro wrestling. Let's be clear about that. But there has to be a fine line to tread between making the sport a sport, making it a modern sport where teams are balanced and everyone wins because the rising tide lifts all boats, um, but at the same time also doesn't turn fans off. And yeah, this is a very fine line to tread. But going back to contradiction one, for instance, if Formula wants to keep Monaco on the calendar indefinitely, it must find a way to make that race interesting. And that was very clear with drivers already suspicious of things that they almost referred to as gimmicks, such as the imposed tire strategy for Monaco 2025. So, in other words, yes, let's respect the heritage of Monaco in particular, but let's find a way to make this entertaining. Number 3 on the list, OEM investment versus long-term commitment risk. Is the grid a house of cards? Now, manufacturers add credibility, funding, and marketing muscle to F1, but they also have a long history of exiting when boardroom sentiment shifts. So Honda, for instance, is one more recent example. This was back in the 2009 season, but of course, there are other examples as well. Now, the current wave, for example, Audi with Sauber, looks promising, but it's always fragile. We can never take anyone's presence for granted. A single recession, regulatory dispute, or scandal could trigger a pullback. F1 must make itself so commercially useful that walking away becomes the irrational move. And this is a decision that apparently Renault Alpine might be wrestling with at the moment. So here's the truth, and it rests on a little bit of knowledge of previous F1 events. The Concord Agreement is a strong structural tool, but it can't outlast a broken marketing case. Now, originally signed in the early 80s, this was a contract between the FIA and FOCA, the Formula One Constructors Association, and Bernie Ecclestone, of course, having a huge part in all of this. Now, the purpose of this Concord Agreement was to lay out the business ground rules between all the parties, which until that point had been operating basically individually. Here's the key point. The modern Concord Agreement is less about quelling internal wars and more about codifying economic stability, so that F1 can present itself like the NFL or Premier League. That is to say, a media asset with long-term visibility and bankable franchise value. Again, though, the Concord Agreement stabilizes the business, not the market case. In other words, we can put rules around what basketball looks like. But if I don't want to play basketball, then those are irrelevant. So this agreement keeps the sport financially predictable for Liberty and the teams that want to participate. But it cannot guarantee that an OEM will stick around if, for instance, the ROI isn't there, the product doesn't match a certain brand or manufacturer's message, or if there are internal strategy shifts, like, for example, EV-only ambitions, which pull them away from F1. That's the structural vulnerability. Economic contracts enforce participation, or rather lay out the rules of the game, but they don't create belief. The moment a manufacturer sees diminishing narrative upside, no amount of contractual stability will hold them in or bring them to the table or the playing field to participate. Number 4, the tech arms race versus regulation gridlock. How does F1 stay at the pinnacle? F1's brand is built on being the most technologically advanced racing series in the world, but its regulatory framework is designed to prevent runaway costs and protect competition. And just look at the current discussion around McLaren's tire cooling and the FIA's quickness to issue guidelines around that topic. Now that creates a constant push-pull. Teams want room to innovate, to build new aero concepts, master tire deg, and find engine edges. The FIA, however, wants parity, cost control, and safety. So here's the risk. Fans may start to see spec racing. Engineers feel constrained. And F1 loses the very genius personified by characters such as Colin Chapman and Adrian Newey, among many others that made it legendary. Formula One is not a spec series, so F1 must find a way to regulate fairly without holding the sport and its competitive nature back. Number 5, live event revenue versus ecosystem expansion. What happens when Vegas isn't enough? Right now, F1's economic engine is logically built on high-paying hosts. So Vegas, Jeddah, Abu Dhabi, etc. Really, every track that hosts an F1 race. That model shouldn't be taken for granted, even if it seems to be working well now. Events cost enormous amounts of money to produce to F1 standard, and it's hard to imagine more races than the current 24. Also, remember how dire the situation became for teams when they could not race because of the global pandemic. So while the world's best racing should always be the backbone of F1, the more the series can stretch into lifestyle territory, the better position it will be in to mitigate issues down the line. Believe it or not, my hypothesis is that F1's off-track potential is still highly underexploited. Subscriptions, gamified content, sim racing, creator storytelling, these could all be long-term flywheels. They're just not leveraged to the fullest extent. And if you still don't believe me, Look at F1 teams as merch and tell yourself with a straight face it's not awful. So the burning question is this: when the live event gold rush ends, will Liberty have built a scalable revenue base? Or will it be scrambling to retrofit an old model into a new media world? Number 6, driver authenticity versus PR robot syndrome. Where do the humans go? Drive to Survive brought in a generation of fans who connected to people, not just cars. They came for Lando Norris's sarcasm, Ricardo's charm, and Alonso's trolling. But that window appears to be closing fast. Max Verstappen, love him or not, is a critical part of the driver landscape because he has opinions and he has the liberty to share them because he is so good. And this is very similar to drivers who are still beloved, like Ayrton Senna and Kimi Raikkonen. They all got away with it because they were at the top of the F1 food chain. But wouldn't the sport be that much richer if everyone were allowed some room? The worst place to be in a consumer facing market is down the middle. You want some people to be repulsed by what you sell because others may love it. And there's a lot of truth to the adage that all news is good news. Drivers today are highly coached professionals who sometimes appear to become pull toys. Ask a question, someone in the back pulls a string, and out comes the answer. But without real human stories, F1 becomes emotionally replaceable. You could make the case that fans don't really care what drivers are saying, as long as it's what's actually on their mind, which in turn gives fans what they really desire, something to debate on Reddit. But jokes aside, this was made very clear when the FIA itself tried to legislate swearing, and this caused a fan uproar across multiple series, not just F1. The grid cannot be 20 walking sponsor logos. It needs flawed, funny, pissed off, vulnerable humans. So let the drivers be characters, not just assets. And finally, number 7. This is something we've touched on, but this is global calendar expansion versus sustainability and burnout. When is enough enough? F1 is running 24 races a year, which means nearly nonstop travel, minimal breaks, and ever more pressure on staff, logistics, and of course, fan attention spans. I know that last one's a little bit hard to understand. I am always very excited about race weekends, as I know everyone else watching F1 is. But in real life, as with everything else, there are diminishing returns to scale. So if you add in sustainability goals, the contradiction becomes painful. And let's think for a moment about the people putting this on. Just reading all of that out makes me exhausted. I mean, the travel schedule and the pressure under which these professionals operate is just another level. So, more races don't necessarily mean more value. They mean burnout, dilution, and backlash. And this goes back to one of the first points. The more you try and popularize and give fans F1, the more likely you increase the chances that they might become tired of it. So, keeping all this in mind, fans can stop caring. Teams can start breaking. Team valuations can feel downwards pressure. So, Liberty Media must balance quantity and impact. That means smarter markets, narrative rich races, and balancing growth with endurance for everyone involved. And yes, to pick on it again, that does mean that Monaco should have to justify its existence to fans. Now, look, if it brings in a ton of cash to fund other F1 initiatives, fair play to the series, but it should be transparent on that fact. So, to wrap this up, here's the final point. Formula One is thriving, but it is not infallible. Nothing ever is, and history is full of examples of companies and brand names and people who just seemed untouchable until they weren't. Beneath the glitz of sold out Grand Prix and viral TikToks lies a series of high stakes contradictions between innovation and regulation, prestige and pop culture, stability and spectacle. Liberty Media has masterfully laid the foundations for F1's business model and built on it. But that success now rests on balancing forces that pull in opposite directions. For instance, the Concord Agreement can lock teams in, but not manufacturers' faith. Expansion can fuel growth, but also burnout. Fan engagement can surge until scripted PR kills the magic. F1's long-term relevance will depend not on avoiding these tensions, but on mastering them. The game isn't just winning races, it's sustaining a global platform where culture, commerce, and competition collide. As always, I want to thank you so much for choosing to spend your time with me on this episode of Return on Racing. If you enjoyed these insights and want more like them, please consider subscribing to the Return on Racing newsletter. This is the weekly newsletter from Voce Analytics covering actionable motorsport strategy, cost breakdowns, and sponsor intel in less than 500 words. So the idea is to deliver insights straight to you in a way that you can apply them directly to your day-to-day operations. And if this sounds interesting to you, please go to the Voce Analytics website, www.voceanalytics.com, and you can sign up right from the front page. Again, I want to thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to speaking with you on the next episode of Return on Racing.